Hi, this is Gabe Cook with Debate Kansas City, and today I'm going to teach you how to give a response speech in Student Congress. Lots of times students think that they need to have some type of prepared speech when they enter a session of Student Congress. And I'm going to tell you that that's not the case, and in fact, some of the best speeches are ones given directly in response to the previous speaker. So what you would do is you would listen to a speech, and you would try to write down the main points of that speech, and then you would write arguments that you could make in response. So the example I'm going to give is going to be based on a resolution that Debate Kansas City has in its middle school packet. The resolution basically says that the United States federal government should make it an obligation, a moral obligation, to end poverty, and that we should devote as many resources as we can to ending poverty. And this seems like a pretty popular piece of legislation. You know, nobody wants to say, I'm against fighting poverty. But what I'm going to show you is how you could give a speech in response, and how you could actually refute somebody who says that we should be in favor of ending poverty. So let's start out with what the pro speaker did. Let's say that the pro speaker stood up and said, you know what, I support this resolution to end poverty, and they gave 3 reasons. Let's say the first reason that they give is that poverty is a really big problem. So I would write that down, and as they're talking, I would write down the points that they're making to explain why poverty is a big problem. This would be a pretty common argument to make in a speech supporting the resolution to end poverty. Let's say the second argument that they make is that the federal government can help. The federal government can take steps and establish programs that can reduce poverty, that it's really just a matter of will with the federal government. And the third and final point we'll say that they made is that the federal government has a moral obligation, that we as a society have a moral obligation to care for the poor, and that we should do everything that we can ethically in order to stop poverty. And these would be some pretty persuasive, pretty reasonable points to make. So what I would do is, as I was listening to the speech, I would have written those points down in shorthand. And what I have here is a sheet of paper and a method that I would use. If I wanted to give a response speech, I could take a sheet of paper and I could put a line right down the middle. And on this side, I would write down what the previous speaker said. And notice that I'm using shorthand. Poverty is a big problem, the federal government can help, and that we have a moral obligation to end poverty. So the speech is happening, and as those points are being made, boom, I write them down. Now what I want to do is I want to write my responses. So check out the first point here, that poverty is a big problem. Well, I wrote down 2 responses that you could use. The first one, and you might not be able to read my shorthand, but it makes it a lot easier when you're in a session of Congress if you can use shorthand. My first one is that the standard of living is up and that we face bigger problems in our country than poverty. Okay, so the previous speaker said poverty is a big problem. I write down 2 arguments I can make against it. I say that the standard of living that we have today is much better than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago, even for people that live in poverty. And I could find evidence to back this point up, and that would be a good thing if I could add it in my speech. But if I didn't have any evidence with me, I could still make that argument. And I could say compare the lifestyle of those in the 70s, 60s, or even go back to the 50s and 40s. The lifestyle that we have now is much better. Most people have air conditioning, most people have cars, etc. So there's an argument to be made that the standard of living is up, which means poverty may not be as big of a problem as what the previous speaker described. And the second argument was that we have many bigger problems to solve. The economy as a whole isn't in very good shape. We're fighting 2 wars. There's also all kinds of problems all over the world that the United States could potentially help with when it comes to foreign aid. And we have other problems here that aren't poverty specific. We need a new energy grid. We need a lot of repair work done on our infrastructure. So I could rattle off a number of other problems that I might argue are a bigger issue than poverty. So that second argument was that the federal government can help, that the federal government can reduce poverty. Well, I came up with a couple of arguments to make in response. The first is that the resolution is impossible to achieve, and the second is that it would cost too much money. Now, once again, these are arguments that I could supplement with evidence, but I could also explain them if I didn't have any evidence. So that first argument, poverty, and the resolution, you can argue that it's impossible to achieve, because what the resolution says is that we must keep fighting poverty basically until we fix it. That we have an obligation to continue fighting poverty until it's gone. Well, I think it's a pretty reasonable argument to say that that's an impossible burden. We can't totally eliminate poverty as much as we would like to and as much as it might make us feel good. we're not going to be able to totally eliminate poverty. And the second argument is that it would cost way too much money. We already have this huge deficit, and we spend billions upon billions of dollars on poverty every year right now. To try to make it our burden to totally end poverty would cost hundreds of billions of dollars that we simply can't afford. Now let's think about that third point, the argument that the speaker made that we have a moral obligation. Well, I could come up and I could say that you must consider the consequences of your actions, and that moral obligation is individual, not federal. Okay, so the pro side says we have a moral obligation to fight poverty without evidence. I could say, you know what? First of all, we have to look to the consequences. There's a lot of different things that we might feel morally obligated to do, but that doesn't mean that the federal government can do all of them, right? There's huge AIDS crisis in Africa, and you might argue that we have a moral obligation to help our fellow peoples, but we don't have the resources to just totally eliminate diseases all over the world, just like we don't have the resources to totally eliminate poverty. And the second argument was that even if you think there is a moral obligation, that moral obligation could be individual, not federal. So if you think poverty is a big problem, well then donate funds to charities that help, or donate your time in soup kitchens, or any number of other ways that you as a person could help to fight poverty. Okay, so I haven't used any evidence, but I've come up with pretty reasonable points against all of the arguments that the previous speaker made. Other things that you can do, you can try to listen to the evidence that the previous speaker may have read and look for flaws in that evidence, or you might look at specific examples that they gave and try to point out why the logic of those examples may be flawed in some ways. So when you stand up to give the speech, okay, you've flowed the speech, you've written the arguments down, you're going to want to have some type of introduction. Then you'll go through your main points of the speech here, and you'll say, you know, I'm just going to refute everything the previous speaker just said. And then at the end, you will have your conclusion, and you would write down some type of closing line there. So you would give the speech as you would give any other speech. You would start out with an introduction. Then you would move on and say, I'm going to oppose this piece of legislation, and I'm going to look at the previous speaker's 3 reasons. And I'm going to tell you why those 3 reasons are not good enough to support this legislation. And then you would go through and you would give your arguments. You would say the speaker's first point was that poverty is a big problem. Well, I have a couple arguments in response that show it's not that big of a problem. And then you would go on down and you would do that the same for point 2 and the same for point 3. And then at the end, you would give some type of conclusion. You might say, look, I know that poverty is an issue that most of us would like to have fixed, but we can't put the burden on the federal government. There are simply too many other responsibilities and too high a cost. So if you want to fight poverty, I say make it an individual, not a federal obligation. And boom, that would be your conclusion. And so you would have an entire speech written, and it's just a response to the previous speaker, and it's going to sound more crisp because it will be off the cuff, which can sometimes be a lot better than a pre-written canned speech where maybe you end up reading too much of it. So there's a suggestion, some tips on how to write a Congress speech that simply refutes what the previous speaker said. Thanks.